So next is time control. The member has little time or energy to question beliefs and associate with outsiders or to examine life too closely. Time spent on group-related activities is strongly encouraged or enforced and usually fills every spare moment.
Let's see. This maybe not so much for the wider trans community, but at the same time, the ideology is really so much in your head all the time that you do see it everywhere. So it
Mm,
maybe it's not so much that the group is imposing that on you all the time, but it does feel like all of your time is getting taken up by it. So to try and come up with an example, and there are less of them now, but 10 years ago, if I was watching literally any video on anything that just talked about like the difference between men and women, for example,
mhm,
then I would have somewhere in the back of my mind, I would be correcting whatever the person was saying in this
mhm,
video. So they might say, men can't give birth or something like that. And I would be like, oh, but trans men can give birth. So actually,
mhm,
men can give birth. And so it's just like it's just constantly correcting other people when the ideology doesn't meet up with you. So I think in that way, it does take up so much of my time, or it did rather
mhm.
take up so much of my time. And just funny, I'm reflecting on it now because now it just feels that the ideology itself has embedded itself in culture that it still takes up all of my time, but it's the opposite now. So I was watching Glow Up recently, for example, and
Mhm.
two of the contestants are some version of trans, basically. And now there are pronouns on the screen every time there's a participant on the screen. There's also pronouns, and there's someone who uses they pronouns, and so again, it feels like it's the ideology coming back to take up my time, and it's not something that I can just tuck away. It's just like a
Mhm.
reminder constantly, although now it's different because back then it was this feeling of no one's ever going to understand me, and I don't know. Yeah, it is a feeling of no one's gonna ever understand me. I'm never going to belong anywhere. All these people are wrong, and how are we ever going to make it
Mhm.
so that they're saying the right thing according to what I think the
Mhm.
ideology should be? And now it's all of these people saying the quote unquote the right thing, and me going, "Oh no, this is all wrong." So
It's funny, you mentioned at the beginning how there's no one person or group demanding and imposing that you spend your time ruminating on or talking about these things. If we look in kind of the parallels with religious groups, you can have groups where you have the strong leader that's forcing everybody to attend meetings for long periods of time. You can listen to documentaries about the Waco group and how there were just hours and hours long scripture studies. Same thing in Jonestown, where they would spend hours and hours listening to those. But there's something different at play here in especially the social media intersection with how people are interfacing with this ideology and this community, where the impulse to spend more time studying, ruminating, and discussing about the ideology comes from within. And I think it's tied to that sense of both acceptance and as well as there's an attraction to the idea that there are people out there who hate our group or mean harm for our group. And so we become closer together. We get a stronger sense of belonging and purpose by spending time talking about both the threat from the outside as well as our own moral superiority and standing for the downtrodden like we do. And I think all of those impulses are very human, they're very normal, but in this case, everything comes together to keep people wanting to be part of that online community. And the fact that we all have phones and computers that make it immediately available take you into that world at any moment. And it's funny listening to some of the detransitioner stories, particularly the early ones with the Peak Resilience project that Benjamin Boyce did with Helena and a couple of others, where they felt like their real world was those moments when they were engaging on Tumblr with other people in the trans community. And it was when they stepped out of that world and interacted with people in real life, that felt like not their actual people, not their actual world. Their real existence was that online existence. And so that presents a constant pull for them to spend more and more time.
And then as you get more into it, people having more abstracted views, more kind of radicalized opinions and statements that they make about this topic.
Hmm.
And it just becomes this massive web of ideas that you're
Hmm.
trying to navigate. And when all of your friends are also doing the same thing and navigating these
Yeah.
ideas that are so separated from reality,
Hmm.
that it's occupying your whole mind. And outside of Tumblr, no one's talking about it.
Yeah.
So when it's occupying your whole mind and it's so abstracted from reality that you can't talk about it anywhere else but Tumblr, then it just makes it impossible to really slow down and
Yeah.
think critically. So when I would be at school, or when I would be participating in activities through school or through my actual real world community, I felt this profound sense of alienation because my priority was Tumblr and my friends on Tumblr.
And there's this one moment in particular where one of them was talking about Scientology, and they were lamenting that they had to study for 2 hours every day and that they thought that was so brainwashy and cult programming. And she said, I was spending 6, 7, 8 hours a day in this community and engulfing myself, saturating myself in the ideology. And so for someone to complain about 2 hours, it's almost laughable.
You can indoctrinate yourself. I've been studying Scientology recently, and they have a mandatory 2.5 hours a day of studying. Do you know, like, the average amount of time a trans kid spends on Tumblr a day?
No.
Way more than 2.5 hours. Do you know the average amount of time trans kids watch YouTube a day? Like, that can combine with Tumblr way more than 2.5 hours. You're just at such a young age, when you're just learning how to, like, think for yourself, you're just, like, inundating yourself with these, like, ideologies that you're internalizing and taking on as your own, but you haven't actually done any of your own self-exploration. You're just absorbing this stuff.
Did it seem to be all encompassing and all overwhelming, where you, like, any free time that you had, you needed to spend in that community, not because somebody imposed it on you, it's just that's how you found your purpose, your worth?
I do feel like that is relatable, but also because I just have an internet addiction. So it wasn't maybe not so much the group itself. And I think it was just the group at that time. That's who it was, I guess, the trans community on Tumblr, or at least just Tumblr in general, where not most of my friends, but a good portion of my friends, at least half of them, were also trans. And what we were just saying actually reminded me of the way so many people respond to what they feel is either transphobia or hatred or whatever, is they tell people to educate themselves. So I feel like that is another part of this controlling people's time, is they do feel like you have the obligation to learn more about. So for example, because I was a trans man, I would have been demanded that I learn more about trans women because they're more oppressed than me, sort of thing. And so I should learn more about their struggles and put more effort into that. So in that sense, yeah, there was a lot of educate yourself, which I think falls under this aspect of it.
No, I've heard that mantra before. Did it ever get into, because I know people who are pushing back around this are starting to say, no, this is a gender ideology, and it didn't come out of nowhere. You can look at academic literature that kind of crystallized and solidified the main pillars on which this whole movement stands, and they'll point to people like Judith Butler or Michel Foucault, or people who were 1960s philosophers all the way up to more recent academicians. Was there any pressure, or did you ever go down that route to say, I really need to understand this stuff from the fundamental level? It's like in the religious context, you need to know the deep doctrine.
I did take a gender and sexuality course in university where that's literally, we were doing a little bit of Judith Butler and Foucault. And it started basically talking about postmodernism and then expanded from there. So in that sense, yeah, I did feel like I needed to put more into it, and I did really well in that course. But I don't know how I feel about that anymore.
There is a sense and a logic to the way that everything is defined. It makes its own internal consistency, I feel like, after studying it. And so I think in that sense, it can be attractive to people who can make sense of it and articulate it in a powerful way. But it does take a lot of time to get to the point where you can do that. Okay, so back on our question of time control, what do you rate it?
See, the thing is, I don't know if it's necessarily encouraged or enforced. It almost just feels like it's self-motivated rather than group enforced.
Yeah, I think what I would rate this is really on how much time did reading or doing activities related to your identity in the movement take up in your life, whether it was self-enforced or externally imposed.
Intense. I think the only thing that I've missed here is that I'm talking a lot about the group dynamics of it. Also, I think most people with gender dysphoria end up spending a whole lot of time thinking about their own bodies by themselves, sort of thing, just like ruminating and hating on themselves. So I think that's another aspect of time control that I didn't really hit, but there is a lot of time that's spent just really putting those ideas around in your head and just thinking about them over and obsessing. But I'm going to say intense.
Okay, and I think listening to you and other conversations as well as other people, particularly if they have a pre-existing autistic dimension, then internalizing all of these new ideas that come from the ideology that then become the focus of how you are analyzing and assessing your body tends, in the religious paradigm, we have something that is where you spend just a whole bunch of time ruminating over religious doctrine, how you're conforming to it, whether or not your soul is in peril. It's a form of hyper-religiosity called religious scrupulosity. So there's this form of religious scrupulosity, which the people who have a high dimension of this in their personality end up spending a whole lot of time concerned about their soul, concerned that they're not fitting things. And it feels like there's a parallel with many of the people who describe their own story, and that can bleed over into this time control. Okay, so we're going to put it at intense. Okay.